He humiliated his wife in front of everyone, but what happened next left him speechless. From the outside, their marriage seemed flawless. Friends and family often commented on how lucky they were to have each other, how their lives seemed so perfectly intertwined. But behind closed doors, things were different. Small, almost imperceptible remarks chipped away at her confidence. It wasn't outright cruelty, but it was enough to make her feel inadequate. At dinner parties, he would correct her stories with unnecessary precision, as if her words alone weren't good enough. At home, he would dismiss her concerns with a laugh, reducing her feelings to mere overreactions. At first, she brushed it off as nothing. Maybe he was just tired from work. Maybe he didn't mean it the way it sounded. But over time, those little moments built up, and the weight of them settled deep in her chest. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she no longer saw the woman she used to be, confident, joyful, full of life. Instead, she saw someone who constantly second-guessed herself, who hesitated before speaking, afraid of saying something that would invite another one of his dismissive comments. One night, as they were getting ready for bed, she gathered the courage to ask him if he had noticed how he treated her lately. He let out a dry chuckle, barely looking up from his phone. "You're imagining things," he said. "You're too sensitive." The words stung, not because they were new, but because she had heard them so many times before that a part of her had begun to believe them. She lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, wondering when things had changed. They used to be different, didn't they? Or had she just ignored the signs all along? Her mind raced, filled with memories of small humiliations, quiet moments of loneliness, and the sinking feeling that she was slowly disappearing in a marriage where she was supposed to feel most seen. Over the following weeks, she began to pay closer attention to the way he spoke to her. The pattern became undeniable. Whenever she expressed an opinion, he had a way of making her feel small. If she made a suggestion, he would smirk and say, "That's not how it works." If she dressed up, he would find a flaw. "That dress is nice, but it's a little tight, isn't it?" If she shared an accomplishment, he would remind her that it wasn't anything special. She started avoiding conversations altogether. If she didn't speak, he couldn't correct her. If she didn't try, she couldn't fail. But the silence only made things worse. It created a distance between them, a void that neither of them acknowledged. He seemed content with it, absorbed in his own world, oblivious to the way she was shrinking inside their home. At work, she found herself feeling more like herself again. Her colleagues valued her input, her boss trusted her decisions, and she didn't have to second-guess every word she said. It was a stark contrast to the woman she had become at home, and it made her realize just how much she had lost in trying to keep the peace. The breaking point came at a family gathering. It was supposed to be a simple evening, just dinner with his parents and siblings. She had spent the entire afternoon preparing, making sure everything was perfect. She wanted to impress them, to show that she belonged. But as soon as they sat down, the criticisms began. She had barely served the food when he laughed and said, "Well, at least she didn't burn it this time." His family chuckled, assuming it was just harmless teasing. But she felt the sting of it, the weight of another moment where she was the joke. As the conversation continued, he corrected her several times, dismissing her opinions in front of everyone. At one point, she tried to share a story, something lighthearted, something to contribute. But before she could finish, he cut in, shaking his head. "That's not exactly how it happened," he said, smirking. "You always get the details wrong." Laughter filled the room, and she felt her face burn. She forced a smile, pretending it didn't hurt. But inside, something snapped. She realized that this wasn't just an offhand comment. This was who he had become. Or maybe this was who he had always been. After the dinner, the ride home was filled with an unbearable silence. She stared out of the window, her mind replaying the evening over and over again. Every laugh at her expense, every dismissive glance, every moment where she had been made to feel small. She wanted to say something, to tell him how much it had hurt, but she knew how the conversation would end. He would roll his eyes, sigh, and tell her she was overreacting. Once home, she went straight to the bedroom, shutting the door behind her. He didn't follow. Instead, he stayed in the living room, watching TV as if nothing had happened. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling with frustration. How had it come to this? When had their marriage turned into a place where she felt more alone than when she was actually alone? For the first time, the thought of leaving him crossed her mind, not as an empty threat, but as a real possibility. Over the next few days, she found herself noticing things she had once ignored. The way he never asked about her day. The way he barely looked up from his phone when she spoke. The way he only acknowledged her presence when he needed something. She had spent so long justifying his behavior that she hadn't realized how much she had lost herself in the process. At work, a colleague complimented her on a project she had completed. "You're really talented," he had said, and the words felt foreign to her, like a language she had once spoken but had long since forgotten. She smiled politely, but inside, she felt an ache. When had she stopped believing in herself? When had she allowed one person's words to define her worth? That evening, she decided to talk to him. She had practiced the conversation in her head all day, choosing her words carefully, trying to find a way to make him understand without making him defensive. As they sat at the dinner table, she took a deep breath and said, "Do you realize how often you put me down?" He raised an eyebrow, chewing slowly before answering. "What are you talking about?" he asked, genuinely confused. She hesitated, then pressed forward. "You embarrass me in front of people. You dismiss everything I say. I feel like I don't matter to you anymore." He scoffed. "You're being dramatic," he said, shaking his head. "I was just joking. Why do you always take things so seriously?" Her heart sank. She had known this would happen, yet part of her had still hoped for something different. Some recognition, some remorse. Instead, all she got was the same dismissive attitude that had slowly eroded her sense of self. Frustrated and emotionally drained, she called her best friend the next day. They met at a small cafe, and as soon as she sat down, she felt the weight of everything pressing against her chest. She didn't even have to explain, her friend had seen the change in her long ago. "You're not crazy," her friend said after listening to her vent. "You're not overreacting. He's tearing you down, and you're letting him." She looked down at her coffee, stirring it absent-mindedly. "I don't know what to do," she admitted. "I love him. Or at least, I think I still do." Her friend reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Then he needs to see what he's losing before it's too late." That evening, she packed a small bag. She wasn't leaving for good, at least not yet, but she needed space. When he saw her suitcase by the door, he frowned. "Where are you going?" "I need time to think," she said simply. "I can't keep living like this." For the first time in a long while, he looked genuinely startled. "You're overreacting again," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. She didn't argue. She simply picked up her bag, walked out the door, and left him standing there, speechless. The first night without her was quiet. Too quiet. He sat on the couch, staring at his phone, expecting a message that never came. She had never done this before. She had always stayed, always forgiven, always dismissed her own feelings to keep the peace. But now she was gone, and for the first time, he felt an unfamiliar sensation creeping in, doubt. He went to bed alone, expecting her to return in the morning. But morning came, and she was still gone. He made coffee for one, sat at a table that felt emptier than usual, and found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, he had made a mistake. Days passed, and her absence was beginning to weigh on him. At first, he had told himself that she would come back soon, that she was just being dramatic. But as time went on, he started noticing things he had previously ignored, the way the house felt colder without her presence, the way the bed felt too big, the way he instinctively reached for his phone to share something with her before remembering she wasn't there. He went to work as usual, but even there, something felt off. A colleague made a joke, and for the first time, he wondered how it would feel to be on the receiving end of one of his own sarcastic comments. He had never considered it before, never thought about how his words might have made her feel. But now, with the silence of their home haunting him, he began to wonder, had he been wrong all along? He had always seen himself as someone rational, someone who never let emotions dictate his actions. But as he sat alone in their quiet house, an unsettling feeling settled over him. He replayed past conversations in his mind, the way he had spoken to her, the way he had dismissed her thoughts so easily. He had always believed he was just being honest, that he was keeping things light-hearted. But now, stripped of her presence, he wondered if his honesty had only been cruelty in disguise. He walked through the house, noticing the small details he had never paid attention to before. The books she had left on the coffee table, the half-empty bottle of her favorite perfume on the dresser, the carefully arranged pillows on the couch. Everything had her touch, yet she wasn't there. And for the first time, he let himself ask a question he had always ignored. Had he ever truly appreciated her, or had he only taken her for granted? At first, he had expected her to text him, to call and ask when they could talk. But as the days stretched on, his phone remained silent. No messages. No missed calls. Nothing. It was a strange feeling. He had spent so much time believing that she would always be there, that she would always forgive him. But now, for the first time, he wasn't sure if she would come back at all. He tried to distract himself with work, but even that felt different. His coworkers noticed his quietness, the way he seemed more distracted than usual. When someone asked if everything was okay, he just nodded, unwilling to admit what was really happening. Deep down, though, he knew he was starting to feel the weight of everything he had ignored for so long. One evening, as he sat on the couch, he picked up his phone and typed out a message. "Can we talk?" He stared at the screen, debating whether to press send. Part of him wanted to believe that things could go back to the way they were. But another part of him knew that wasn't possible. She had left for a reason, and if he truly wanted to fix things, he had to understand why. Minutes passed, then an hour. Finally, his phone buzzed. Her reply was short, "I don't know if I'm ready." His chest tightened. She wasn't ignoring him, but she wasn't rushing back either. For the first time in their relationship, she was setting a boundary. And he realized, with a sinking feeling, that he had given her every reason to do so. 2 days later, she finally agreed to meet. They sat across from each other at a small cafe, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. She looked different, calmer, more sure of herself. And for the first time in a long while, he felt nervous. "I need you to understand something," she said, her voice steady. "I didn't leave because of one bad night. I left because I was losing myself in this marriage. I was disappearing." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had thought she was just upset about the family dinner, that she had overreacted. But now, looking at her, he realized how deeply he had hurt her. And worse, he had never even noticed. He wanted to defend himself, to say he hadn't meant to hurt her. But he knew that wouldn't change anything. So instead, for the first time, he listened. He listened as she told him about the times he had made her feel small, the moments she had swallowed her pain just to keep the peace. Every example was a memory he had brushed off, moments he had convinced himself didn't matter. But now, hearing them through her eyes, he saw them differently. "I don't know if you can change," she admitted. "I don't even know if you want to." Her words stung, but he couldn't deny them. Change wasn't something he could promise with empty words. If he truly wanted to make things right, he had to prove it. That night, he sat alone and thought about everything she had said. It would have been easy to get defensive, to insist that she was exaggerating. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had let his pride get in the way for too long. He had dismissed her feelings, believing that as long as things were fine on the surface, nothing else mattered. He didn't want to be that person anymore. He didn't want to be the man who made his wife feel invisible. But wanting to change and actually changing were two different things. He had spent years making her feel unimportant. How could he possibly undo all of that? The next time they spoke, he didn't try to justify himself. Instead, he asked her something he had never asked before: "How can I do better?" The question caught her off guard. She hesitated, studying his face, trying to decide if he was truly serious. "Start by listening," she said simply. "Not just hearing me, but actually listening." It was a small request, but it felt massive. He had never considered how often he dismissed her words, how rarely he truly paid attention to what she was feeling. He knew that words alone wouldn't fix things. He had to show her that he was willing to do the work. Over the next few weeks, he made a conscious effort to change the way he treated her. It wasn't easy. There were moments when he caught himself slipping, moments when he wanted to argue or defend himself. But every time, he reminded himself why he was doing this, because he loved her, because he didn't want to lose her. She noticed the difference, but she was hesitant to trust it. After all, how many times had he dismissed her concerns before? How many times had she convinced herself that things would get better, only to be disappointed? She wanted to believe in his change, but she wasn't sure if she could. One evening, he asked her to meet him for dinner. This time, he didn't rush to explain himself. He didn't try to make excuses. Instead, he looked her in the eye and said the words he had never said before. "I was wrong," he admitted. "I hurt you. And I didn't even realize how much. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I want to be better. Not just for you, but because I don't want to be the kind of man who treats his wife like that." She searched his face, looking for signs of insincerity. But for the first time, she saw something she hadn't seen before: genuine remorse. Not just regret for losing her, but regret for the way he had made her feel. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was capable of change. Even after his apology, things did not immediately fall into place. She was cautious, measuring every word he spoke, waiting for signs that this change was temporary. He understood why, after years of dismissing her, how could she trust that he wouldn't fall back into old habits? The only thing he could do was prove himself through actions, not promises. He started small, truly listening when she spoke, asking about her day without rushing to talk about his own. These weren't grand gestures, but they were the things that had always been missing. One evening, she tested him without meaning to. She voiced an opinion about something trivial, a choice in decor, a book she had read, and instinctively braced herself for his usual response, a correction or a dismissive remark. But instead, he nodded thoughtfully. "That's interesting," he said. "Tell me more." It was a simple response, but the impact it had on her was undeniable. For the first time in years, she felt like what she said actually mattered. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could truly change. As the days passed, she found herself caught between hope and hesitation. She wanted to believe in the man sitting across from her at dinner, the one who now seemed to weigh his words before speaking. But she also knew how easy it was to fall into old habits, how effortless it would be for him to slip back into his former self. Could she trust that this version of him was real? Or was this just another phase that would fade as soon as he got comfortable again? He sensed her hesitation, and instead of growing frustrated, he acknowledged it. "I know I don't deserve your trust yet," he admitted one night. "But I'll keep proving myself until I do." It was another small moment, but it meant everything. It showed her that this wasn't just about fixing things quickly, it was about real change, the kind that took time. And for the first time, she felt herself wanting to believe in them again. The real test came at another family gathering, nearly identical to the one that had driven her to leave. As they sat at the dinner table, a familiar situation unfolded. She told a story, and someone questioned a detail. Normally, this would have been his cue to step in, to correct her in front of everyone. But this time, he didn't. Instead, he simply smiled and let her speak. It was a small thing, something no one else even noticed. But she noticed. And that moment, more than any words he could have spoken, showed her that he was trying. Later that night, as they walked to the car, she turned to him and said, "I saw what you did back there." He looked at her, uncertain. "And I appreciate it." The relief in his eyes was immediate. It was the first time she had acknowledged his effort, and it meant more to him than he expected. They weren't back to where they had once been, but for the first time in a long while, they were moving in the right direction. As their relationship slowly mended, a moment came that neither of them had expected. One evening, as they sat together in the quiet of their home, he let out a heavy sigh. "You know," he said, his voice quieter than usual, "I think I treated you that way because I was afraid." She looked at him, surprised. "Afraid of what?" she asked. He hesitated before answering. "Afraid of not being enough," he admitted. "I thought that if I always had the upper hand, if I controlled the conversation, then I wouldn't have to face the idea that maybe I wasn't as smart, or as capable, or as perfect as I wanted to believe." His honesty caught her off guard, but it also gave her something she hadn't expected, understanding. He wasn't excusing his actions, but for the first time, she saw beyond them. And in that moment, she realized that maybe, just maybe, he was finally beginning to understand himself too. After that conversation, something shifted between them. She had spent so long seeing him as the man who had torn her down, that she had never considered what might have been driving him to act that way. That didn't make his actions right, but it did make them human. and for the first time, she saw him not just as the person who had hurt her, but as someone who was struggling with his own flaws, just as she had been struggling with hers. This newfound empathy didn't erase the past, but it did help them move forward. They started talking more openly, discussing things they had never discussed before. And with each conversation, the walls between them started to come down. Slowly, they were rebuilding not just their marriage, but the foundation of trust and respect that had been missing for so long. She didn't wake up one morning and suddenly trust him again. It wasn't that simple. Trust wasn't something that could be repaired overnight, it had to be earned, piece by piece. But as the weeks went on, she found herself hesitating less, believing in his words more. And most importantly, she began to feel like herself again. She no longer held back when she spoke. She no longer second-guessed every opinion she shared. And instead of dismissing her, he embraced this version of her, the woman he had fallen in love with but had failed to truly appreciate. He realized now just how lucky he was that she had given him the chance to make things right. And he wasn't going to waste it. What they had now wasn't the same as what they had before. It wasn't about going back to how things used to be, but about creating something new, something better. Their marriage had been cracked, but instead of breaking completely, they had found a way to rebuild it, stronger than before. They still had disagreements, of course. No relationship was perfect. But now, instead of trying to win arguments, he listened. Instead of dismissing her feelings, he acknowledged them. And instead of taking her for granted, he made sure she knew, every single day, that she mattered. One evening, as they sat together, she turned to him and said, "Do you think we would have made it if I hadn't left?" He thought about it for a long moment before shaking his head. "No," he admitted. "I don't think I would have understood how much I was hurting you if you hadn't shown me what it was like to live without you." His honesty made her chest tighten. She had spent so long wondering if she had made the right choice in walking away, but now she knew she hadn't just saved herself. She had saved them both. A few months later, she faced a moment where she saw just how much he had changed. They were out with friends when she made a small mistake telling a story. Everyone laughed, waiting for him to correct her. But he didn't. Instead, he just smiled, letting her speak. And when the night ended, he turned to her and said, "I love hearing you talk." It was such a small thing, but it meant everything. It was proof that this wasn't just an act, he had truly changed. And for the first time in a long time, she felt completely, undeniably safe with him. It had taken time, effort, and painful honesty, but they had finally reached a place where love and respect were balanced. He no longer feared vulnerability, and she no longer feared being unheard. Their marriage wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time in years, that was enough. As they sat together, looking at the life they had rebuilt, he took her hand and said, "I don't deserve a second chance, but I promise I'll never stop proving that I'm worthy of it." And she smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because she finally believed him. This time, she knew they would be okay.